Beginning in 1689, Great Britain and France fought a series of wars for control of colonial trade. The portion of these wars fought over control of land in the Ohio River Valley in the Americas between 1754 and 1763 was called the French and Indian War. The French persuaded their American Indian allies to join their fight, but eventually the British won the war. Terms for ending the French and Indian War were agreed upon in the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war in 1763. France turned control of Canada over to Britain. France also surrendered all claims to land east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of the city of New Orleans. After the war, colonists flooded into the Ohio River Valley, and colonial businesses expanded to prosperous trade networks in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. However, not everyone was happy with this expansion. In 1763, Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa Nation led a coalition of American Indians in an attempt to drive British and American families out of the Ohio Valley. As a result, the British Parliament issued the Proclamation of 1763, calling for an end to American settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. But Americans ignored the order. The prosperity of the American colonies, which Britain fought to protect, was a source of potential revenue. British tariffs on colonial goods existed, but were largely ignored. But 70 years of war left Great Britain nearly bankrupt. In an act meant to replenish British coffers, but perceived as a sudden shift, British authorities put more rigid taxes and customs in place to prevent Americans from dodging tariffs. The Stamp Act of 1765 established more taxes. Small taxes were imposed on newspapers. Larger taxes were applied to documents, such as lawyers' licenses. The Stamp Act affected nearly every American colonist. It was quickly condemned. In response, the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly created a Committee of Correspondence to communicate with the other colonies. New York organized a meeting called the Stamp Act Congress to draft formal petitions against Parliament. Merchants in New York organized a boycott of British goods. In Boston, Samuel Adams organized the Sons of Liberty to stage protests. Tax collectors were hung in effigy during these demonstrations. In 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. The law lasted barely a year. But a year later, Parliament passed a new series of tax laws. They also expanded the customs service and added more admiralty courts. Americans renewed their protests. Boycotts of British goods were popular. A group of women in Boston, called the Daughters of Liberty, wove cloth on home looms. This meant it was no longer necessary to buy imported cloth. Protests in Boston were so fierce that customs officials were granted military protection. The presence of British military personnel increased tensions. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. On the surface, the law seemed to reduce the price of tea in all British colonies, but many suspected the real motive was to expand Britain's tea monopoly. Colonial ports turned away British ships carrying tea, or refused to handle the cargo. In Boston, the royal governor ordered that tea shipments be kept on board until they could be unloaded. On December 16th of 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded tea ships and destroyed the cargo. In response, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. The laws were designed to crack down on Massachusetts and other colonies. Instead, the Intolerable Acts energized the colonies against the British government. In January of 1776, the pamphlet Common Sense was published anonymously. Its secret author, Thomas Paine, gave a clearly worded argument for independence that anyone could understand. It is generally believed that it was read or heard by almost every colonist. Thomas Paine's argument persuaded many who were undecided about their loyalty to support American independence from Great Britain.